As I'm sure you all know, my dear viewers, hand sewing is complicated and time-consuming. What you do not yet know is that recently, while riding the high of having just finished hand appliquing lace onto a tulle corset, I signed up for a class on how to make a 16th century kirtle, entirely by hand. Now, my hand sewing is actually pretty good. I've been at it a while, but I would like to be more confident at it if I'm going to sew a whole kirtle. Luckily, I have a couple of projects in mind, and I already have most of the supplies I need. The first practice piece I had in mind was the sewing bag from Burnley and Trowbridge. Back in 2020, they sold a kit for this, and I excitedly bought it, put it on a shelf, and it's been sitting in my to-do pile ever since. When I bought the kit to embroider the pouch, I also bought this sewing kit. I figured I would need stuff to go in it. It has beeswax, needles, a brass thimble, linen thread, a pair of scissors, a thread holder, and this pack of 25 brass pins. I prefer leather thimbles, so I'll be using this one instead of the brass one. The pouch itself included 2 pieces of silk, one for the exterior and one for the lining, a silk ribbon for the drawstring, and some silk thread to sew it all together. There were no instructions included in the pouch kit, but there's a YouTube video, so I've been following along with that. At first, I thought this was going to be a quick and easy project. But why even hand sew a silk pouch if you're not going to be supremely extra about it? So, when a few minutes into the sew along video, I learned that these were traditionally hand embroidered, I was hooked. Unfortunately, I went back and forth before committing to hand embroidering and had actually torn the silk fabric down to size for the pouch. This caused some problems I'll go into later on. But before we get there, I had to pick a pattern. For this, I used the book Costume Close-Up. This book has pictures of extant 18th century garments from colonial Williamsburg. In particular, it shows the details of an 18th century pocket that I'm sure you've seen before. Since this is a detailed enough picture to photocopy and traced, I picked this, but it didn't show me which stitches were used. Next, I went to the book 18th Century Embroidery to learn more about how embroidery during this period was done. While I didn't have all the fancy equipment to rig up the embroidery frame the way it would have been done historically, I did get to see the stitches and colors that would have been used. I'm not very experienced in embroidery, and I didn't want to start out on my silk, so I first did a test piece on some quilter's cotton I had. I used a light board and pencil to trace on my design, and then did some test embroidery. This was helpful for learning the stitches, like the stem stitch. When doing test pieces like this, please remember that they are throwaway pieces. It can be easy to want to make them usable because none of us wants to waste time or fabric, but that can also make them a little bit too precious, meaning that we're afraid to try things that may not work. Instead of needing your piece to be usable at the end, assume it's not going to be and just experiment. Afraid your needle is too big or your stitches won't look good? This is the place to figure that out. Once I was happy with that piece, I moved on to the scrap of silk I had torn off my pouch piece. I wanted to try stitching on silk before I did the pouch. The techniques transferred pretty well, but I did find that the needles that worked for quilter's cotton were far too big for silks, so I had to use finer needles and less thread, which took a little longer but did come out beautifully. I also tested friction pins on the silk at this stage. It was better than the pencil in terms of the marks lasting, but the pin doesn't entirely disappear when ironing if your fabric is silk. I decided to use the friction pin anyway, since it was all going to be covered with embroidery. Once I was happy with both of those tests, I moved on to the real thing. I hooped the fabric and quickly discovered that silk frays. A lot. Like a lot. I was constantly picking long blue threads out of my embroidery and trimming them as they pulled away from the fabric. By the end, I think I lost a 1/4 inch of the edges to fraying. I'm still really glad I only chose part of the embroidery from the pocket to do, as this was less time consuming and meant less fraying at the edges overall. My embroidery is a mix of stem stitches, long and short stitches, and satin stitches. There is one area with chain stitching that I'm less happy with, but overall I think it looks really good. Some people will tell you that when doing embroidery, the back of your work should look as neat as the front. These people are not me and they do not live my life. The back of my work is functional and will hold. And since the project is lined, it will be completely hidden and never seen by anyone, except for that part where it's saved on YouTube in perpetuity. But besides that, I wonder if the Library of Congress saves YouTube videos like they used to save tweets. That would be some immense storage. But I digress. Several days later, I finally finished up the embroidery and was able to iron out the piece. Even after ironing, there are still some wrinkles from the hoop, which I'm hoping relax over time. These flowers in the fill came out beautifully and I love the colors. My only complaint is that the blue flower over here just doesn't match the rest of the embroidery and came out kind of dull and muddy. I wouldn't do that specific flower again, or at least I wouldn't do it that way, but I love the center one especially. Part of me kept wondering if I should just skip the embroidery and make the pouch. I loved sitting there and hand embroidering it, and I'm really happy with how it came out. So I can't really be sad about it taking it longer. After all, what we're here to do is find joy in the process. I also definitely want to embroider more things now because that was a lot of fun. And now, stay tuned for the next video where I actually sew the silk pouch I intended for this video. And you'll get to see me hulk out and rip this beautiful silk fabric by hand. With that, my dear viewers, I bid you all farewell. Until next time.